mental health and wellbeing. I'm Stephanie from WorkSafe Tasmania, your moderator. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people, the original and continuing custodians of the land, sea and sky. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal people, all of whom have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity, culture and Aboriginal rights. We now ask that you take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. Please use the chat window on your control panel to type and submit any questions for today's presenter. These questions will be addressed throughout today's presentation. There is also a handout now available for you to download. So please head into the handouts window and download that handout. Only presenter webcams will be used during this presentation, and today's presentation is also being recorded. It is now my pleasure to introduce your presenter today, Kylie Van Leeuwen from Elevated Coaching and Consulting Global. Kylie is a renowned international speaker, best-selling author and award-winning human rights and diversity consultant. With over 14 years of global experience, Kylie specialises in workplace diversity, equity, inclusion, and psychological safety. Kylie holds a degree from Harvard Business School and is a certified psychotherapist, emotional intelligence coach, and NLP master practitioner. Kylie is also a founding member of the International Strategic Psychotherapists Association. Kylie has advanced human resources and leadership qualifications, and her first book on emotional intelligence in leadership was published in 2023. Welcome, Kylie.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon everybody who's joining us. Welcome to this webinar on building resilient minds and cultivating psychological safety for enhanced mental health and wellbeing. Before I jump into the slides or continue with the presentation, I've got to remember to click the slides on this side as well. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where we meet today and their connections to land, water, culture and community. Please feel free to pop in the chat box if you feel comfortable where you're joining from today. Today I'm joining you from the Eora Nation, home of the Gadigal people here in Sydney City. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that respect to all First Nations peoples attending today. So a little bit about us before we jump in, so you understand, I guess, a tiny bit of my background and just my passion for workplace psychological safety and wellbeing. So my name is Kylie and I am the founder of Elevated Coaching and Consulting Global. And with a background in human rights and leadership and psychotherapy, I'm extremely passionate about fostering workplace inclusion, psychological safety and wellbeing, as well as reducing workplace abuse, harm and psychological injuries globally. I've just actually spent the past year living and expanding my company in the US, and I currently serve as the Vice President and on the Board of Directors of a global nonprofit called HR4U. At HR4U, we advocate for workplace fairness and inclusion globally, improved workplace psychological safety, and for all American workers to be paid a living wage regardless of their background or the state that they live in. As a human rights consultant and DEI practitioner, I've advocated for safer and more inclusive work environments for all workers for decades. Our mission at Elevated Coaching and Consulting is to empower leaders, teams and organisations so all employees can reach their full potential and thrive while they're at work. Our team brings extensive experience in creating awareness of psychological safety and wellbeing, cultivating inclusion and a sense of workplace belonging, and promoting employee safety. And today we're going to explore elevating workplace practices and leadership practices to foster psychological safety and wellbeing. So the question probably you're all asking is, well, what are we going to cover today? So this afternoon, or for the next hour or so, we're going to cover what the definition and benefits of workplace inclusion, intersectionality and psychological safety, best practices for fostering and sustaining workplace inclusion and psychological safety and wellbeing, Understanding why intersectionality is critical in fostering workplace psychological safety, well-being and inclusion, and why you can't have one of those without the other, but also exploring the concepts to foster a culture of inclusion, respect, belonging and safety that supports employees' well-being and organisational success. I'll provide strategies throughout the next hour for creating a more inclusive workplace culture and identifying things in the workplace like microaggressions and bias. So there's a common misconception when it comes to inclusion that environments in which diversity and equity are priorities, that they naturally result in inclusion. I hear this all the time from my consulting clients. They say we've built equitable practices into our organisational processes, leading to far more diverse and well-represented teams. So people have to feel included in an organisational setting like that, right? Well, not always, as it turns out. Inclusion is the extent to which various team members, employees, and other people feel a sense of belonging and value within a given organisational setting. The important distinction here is that even among the most diverse teams, and many of you may have experienced this in your own workplaces, there's not always a feeling of inclusion and certainly not always feelings of workplace belonging. For example, women might be well represented at the senior management level, but still not feel included due to long-standing gender norms, pay to or salary discrepancies, and also any other factors that might impact those women. So the barriers to achieving inclusion success when we're talking about workplaces include, well, the main one for me that I see in my work is that inclusion objectives aren't built into the organisation's business objectives. So listing inclusion as part of the values of an organisational company is just not enough. And quite often from leadership teams and C-suite executives, I hear that they have done that, just included inclusion as a value or part of their values, but then there's not a lot of action happening on the ground. So inclusion must be a business priority that's actually tied to business success measures. Of the other challenges in fostering inclusion, the lack of accountability among senior stakeholders for achieving inclusion objectives for the organisation is also a critical problem that we see. It's assumed, unfortunately, and if I've got any HR practitioners or DEI practitioners joining us this afternoon, you might be nodding your head to this, but it's often assumed that it's HR's problem to deal with. In mitigation of this, inclusion objectives need to be cascaded from the organisation's objectives into the performance expectations and measures of success, particularly for senior stakeholders. So some of the strategies for creating an inclusive workplace that recognises and values diversity and also intersectionality, which we'll get to in a couple of slides, include providing opportunities for language, cultural competence and awareness training and support, incorporating diverse perspectives and experiences in decision-making and problem-solving processes. The third one is ensuring equal access to professional development and advancement opportunities, recognising and addressing microaggressions and discrimination in the workplace, not just recognising those things, but then taking action and having a zero tolerance to those things in the workplace. And then the last one that I've listed there is creating a culture of respect, trust and inclusivity through clear communication, active listening and empathy. And not just empathy, but empathetic leadership as well. Now, as we move to the next slide, I absolutely love this quote because quite often when it comes to diversity, inclusion and psychological safety efforts, we're often asked the question, how? That's probably one of the biggest questions that I get asked from my clients. We recognise we have an issue, but Kylie, how do we go about this? And how do we embrace diversity and foster an inclusive and psychologically safe workplace? Well, that's what we're going to unpack now. Oops, I went a little bit too far there, apologies. So when we talk about intersectionality acknowledges that individuals have multiple identities that interact and intersect with one another, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and socioeconomic status. Embracing intersectionality in the workplace or adopting what we call an intersectional approach means acknowledging the intersecting identities of your employees and their different experiences, and understanding how this impacts their work life, and using these insights, particularly as leaders, to create an inclusive work environment. The term intersectionality was originally coined by a lady in the United States called Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And intersectionality has gained in popularity and is often discussed nowadays as a theory, a framework, a lens, or a paradigm. It recognises that people's lives are shaped by their identities, their relationships, and social factors. And these combine to create intersecting forms of privilege and oppression depending on a person's context and existing power structures such as patriarchy, ableism, homophobia, and racism. It's important to remember the transformative potential of intersectionality, particularly when we're talking about the workplace, which extends beyond merely a focus on the impact of intersecting identities. In essence, intersectionality is a way of thinking about identity and its relationship to power. Gee, sorry folks, I keep going a little too far. So I love this slide because when we talk about workplace psychological safety and well-being, in the context of also adopting an intersectional approach to that, which all sounds a little confusing, I know, or a little complicated, this slide here on the this grey slide captures that perfectly. And I'll read it for those of you that may not be able to see this. But a workplace says a workplace culture that feels safe, fun, and productive for some team members may feel profoundly unsafe for others. Recognizing that this is the case is an essential first step for any leader committed to building a psychologically safe culture for all. And there's a quote from a poet called Audre Lorde that I absolutely love. And I think I say this almost every time I present. And it goes, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And that in itself is intersectionality. So it's not simply that there's a race problem or a gender problem. Many times traditional inclusion frameworks erase what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. And so when we talk about things like disability employment or disability inclusion in the workplace, an example of that is a person with a disability who is also somebody perhaps from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. So they have intersecting identities that may even more disadvantage them or give them greater barriers and challenges that we need to acknowledge in the workplace when we're talking about psychological safety and wellbeing. So we need to focus on the entire person rather than a single label that's been assigned by another person. And when we talk about inclusion efforts in organisations, company inclusion programs that don't take intersectionality into account risk overlooking key experiences. And some of these include inability to attract and recruit diverse talent, especially when we know there's skills and workforce shortage, particularly in key sectors globally at the moment, and really over the last 4 years. There's also greater wage inequality, lack of professional development for people, higher turnover rates, and also higher absenteeism, hiring discrimination and inequities in unemployment, and increased harassment and discrimination. Now, unlike the United States, luckily here in Australia, we have legislation that protects workers from psychological abuse and harm in the workplace. And yes, the burden of proof is solely relies on the complainant, if you like, or the victim of that psychological abuse or harm. But in the States, and this is part of the work that I do, they have zero legislation at the moment. And we are working really hard with senators and policymakers and corporations across the whole of the United States to have the very first ever Workplace Psychological Safety Act passed in all states across America as legislation to protect all American workers against psychological abuse and harm. So it's bad news for employers too, because as employees who face discrimination linked to intersectionality, they're more likely to leave the organisation. They're also the employers more at risk of things like lawsuits, workers' compensation claims, and things that I'm sure everybody in this audience this afternoon is very well versed in. So adopting an intersectional approach involves building intersectionality into recruitment strategies, ensuring people have opportunities to discuss issues, and adopting an open and empathetic leadership style. Goodness me. I think my finger's a little too happy to keep skipping. So we've been talking about psychological safety, what I'm going to do now is actually define it for those of you who aren't familiar with the terminology psychological safety. So organisational behavioural scientist Amy Edmondson first introduced the construct of team psychological safety, and it can be defined as the shared belief that it's safe to take risks and be vulnerable. Sounds simple. And I think we all need that. We can all recognise that that's really very important when it comes to workplace and employee wellbeing and mental health. She also defined it as a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, or concerns or mistakes. Again, it sounds really simple, and absolutely, it's a basic human right, essentially, when we're at work. Without psychological safety, no amount of effort and resources in creating a meaningful wellbeing approach for your people will deliver the wellbeing impact that you seek. Fascinatingly, psychological safety was also found by research conducted by Google to be the most important of the 5 key dynamics that make successful teams, knocking structure, clarity, and meaningful work out of pole position in the process. So that just demonstrates just how important psychological safety is, not only to the employee mental health and well-being, but also to team success, which we all know leads to organisational success. Many years ago, actually, a health and safety leader in my previous workplace described employee wellbeing as a slow accident. And I thought that was such a powerfully accurate description. After all, when we consider health and safety, we generally think about the obvious, the trips, slips and falls in the workplace, back injuries, ergonomics, those immediately obvious hazards that cause accidents. Employee wellbeing is often more intangible than traditional health and safety. And I think thankfully, it's starting to gain a lot of traction now globally as a key issue in organisations. The personal and business outcomes often take longer to witness when it comes to employee wellbeing and also psychological safety or psychological harm and injuries. A poorly designed job role, an ill-equipped manager, unrealistic workloads, a blame culture, these things can take months or years to manifest as poor employee wellbeing, and then the burden of proof to demonstrate that harm or that injury has occurred, like I was saying earlier, that lies with the complainant or the victim of psychological abuse, harm, or injury. So quite often, as we know, people just they leave an organisation and it's never truly captured or monitored why people are truly leaving organisations when it comes to psychological harm. So teams with strong psychological safety are less afraid of the negative consequences that may result from things like taking smart risks, making mistakes, sharing their opinions with their team, being candid with one another. And because of this, these teams are more likely to share their opinions when they differ from one another. For example, avoiding groupthink, and they take initiative when it matters most. And I'm sure at least half of you in the audience this afternoon could probably, and again, if you want to and you feel comfortable putting this in the chat, have either been in a workplace where this has happened or seen the effects of a workplace lacking psychological safety. But I certainly have, and that's why I'm so passionate about this topic and building awareness. So the relationship between psychological safety and inclusion is that psychological safety is a key component of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Diverse opinions, experiences, and knowledge can be better leveraged if team members feel comfortable about speaking up and they're accustomed to considering alternate viewpoints. I've also been in those organisations, and I can tell you which one I'd rather be in. So when we talk about psychological safety, we also need to talk about psychosocial safety, which refers to a safe environment, organisational systems that are clear, easy to use and supportive, but also safe social systems. So when we're talking about safe social systems, we're talking about people and relationships. Psychosocial risks are negative forms that can harm employee wellbeing and productivity. And it's important because it fosters positive workplace culture, trust, collaboration, innovation, and employee wellbeing, which in turn leads to higher productivity, morale, employee engagement, job satisfaction, and retention. And I haven't even included the legal side of things that we know result when there's not psychological safety and psychosocial hazards aren't addressed. So while psychosocial hazards highlight potential threats to employee well-being within our workplace, psychological safety champions the creation of a work culture where employees can thrive. Leaders must address psychosocial hazards to mitigate potential harm while simultaneously cultivating psychological safety to create a positive, productive, and inclusive workplace culture. Psychosocial hazards can create stress. So those of us that work in this field, we know this. This can cause psychological or physical harm. And we know that stress itself is not an injury. But if workers are stressed often over a long period of time, or the level of stress is high, it can cause harm. And that's what we see a lot in the work that we do supporting people going through workers' compensation claims here in New South Wales. Some common examples of psychosocial hazards include severe, prolonged, or frequent occurrences of things like working long hours or without enough supervision, or without enough breaks, for instance, not enough manager or supervisory support, not enough support being provided for changes, so things like not training employees on how to use new tools or techniques or technologies, conflicting or frequently changing expectations and work standards, so things like changing deadlines or contradictory instructions. We see that actually a lot. That seems to be something that's increasing at the moment. And then also policies or procedures that are unfair, biased, or applied inconsistently. So things like favoritism when assigning good shifts if you're a shift worker. Psychological injuries in the workplace are increasingly recognised as a significant issue both in Australia and globally. In Australia, work-related mental health conditions have been rising as a proportion of serious workers' compensation claims for a number of years, and that's attributed to a number of different reasons. One being the awareness of psychological injuries in the workplace and psychological harm, but the other, and there's many more that I won't list, but the other is people being aware of these things and actually reporting on them. And hopefully, I think in the future, we'll see a lot more employers taking action to address these. So we've got two slides there on the screen, the why and the how. And the why, when it comes to psychological safety, is when people feel safe enough to raise their hands and say, I made a mistake or I need some help, the leader has created an environment where people feel safe to be themselves. It's especially crucial when we think about disability inclusion in the workplace, because it supports employees with disability to feel valued, supported, and empowered to contribute fully. Without the right environment, one that makes it safe to fail, and importantly, one that makes it safe to learn and contribute, retaining people with disability is difficult, and the workplace experiences for people with disability remain poor, as well as the retention rates. This is the core of an inclusive and empowering workplace, one where everyone can thrive, belong, and contribute to a better working world. Psychological safety is also critical to support disclosures of disability in the workplace. And this is a big piece of work I'm doing here in Australia at the moment with the impending Disability Employment Services contract coming up. Looking at how do we make workplaces comfortable, safe, and inclusive of people with disabilities so that those that are already in the organisation or those that join the organisation feel safe to disclose their disability. So suppose a workplace has an absence of psychological safety. In that case, people with disability are less likely to feel safe and comfortable to disclose their disability, and this includes any workplace modifications or adjustments that they may need to do their job, perform their job optimally. And I'm mentioning this because we know that one of the primary disabilities in this country is mental health. So this is why I'm actually talking about this particular group of people. But leaders disclosing disabilities and having a greater representation of leaders with disabilities is also critical to achieving more positive disability employment outcomes and retention of people with disability across Australia. So Timothy Clark, some of you may be familiar with Timothy Clark's work, but he was the author of the 4 stages of psychological safety. And he describes it, I love how he describes it actually. He describes it as an environment of rewarded vulnerability. Psychological safety is a straightforward concept that risks being lost in the depths of management speak unless we bring it to life. And thankfully, the hard work of researching and writing about it has already been done by the likes of Amy Edmondson and Timothy Clark. And you'll see on this slide that some of the benefits and some of the consequences of psychological safety are things like staff retention, which we all want, less staff on leave and less absenteeism, more innovation and more collaboration, a more positive workplace culture, more inclusion, client satisfaction and client outcomes, because we know if our staff aren't happy, our clients are unlikely to be happy and satisfied, productive and high-performing teams, and also impact on bottom line. Now, without psychological safety, an environment cannot be inclusive. Psychological safety allows for inclusion, for employees to feel a sense of belonging and trust, and for rapport to be developed. And we know that when people don't feel safe, they don't connect. They don't connect to their peers, but they also don't connect to their leaders. So without this, workplace performance, innovation, collaboration, and staff retention are almost impossible. And at best, employee performance and organisational progress will stall. Psychological safety is often erroneously thought of as simply being about maintaining confidentiality or about enabling moaning or dissent in the business. And I often hear skepticism about psychological safety, particularly in the States at the moment, because some people feel it gives permission for poor behaviour or low performance gets ignored or remains unacknowledged. Amy Edmondson and Timothy Clark, who was on that previous slide, they are crystal clear about this. Psychological safety means that everyone in the business or the organisation is just as empowered to speak up when performance falls below standard as they are when performance peaks and needs to be celebrated. Both are discussed, examined objectively, and the lessons learned and applied, and hopefully egos can be dropped. However, the sticky moments start when we consider why wellbeing measures are not being recorded, why employees stop engaging in programs, why employees neglect to share their thoughts and feelings about how work impacts their personal wellbeing and performance. Creating a culture of wellbeing in your business is intrinsically linked to your entire organisational culture. They're not separate entities. You can't have one without the other. Inclusion in turn creates and supports diversity and all the benefits that we know come with having a diverse workforce and tapping into diverse talent pools to support and represent the diverse clientele that we support and serve. And finally, diversity is what facilitates performance, including achieving individual and organisational performance and the progress that leads to growth, outcomes, and important individual milestones. Now, I've been talking for a couple of slides now, so I'm going to hand it over to our audience and ask you a question. How would you currently rate the level of psychological safety and wellbeing in your team or in your organisation? Okay, we've got a couple coming through. Oh, I'm liking seeing so many hi there. That's positive and promising. We do have an equal amount coming through for moderate, and we do have quite a few low as well. So it's looking like the majority is sitting in that moderate section. So it's, and I always say this to my clients, psychological safety, workplace inclusion, and improving workplace culture is an ongoing, never-ending journey and process. It's continuous improvement. And so if you're one of the people that has responded with high, congratulations, especially if you're a leader in that organisation and you're a part of fostering such high psychological safety and wellbeing. If you're somebody that has responded as moderate, and we've got 28 responses there, so 38% of the audience has responded with moderate, that will tell me that you're You're not quite there on your journey yet, but you don't have a psychologically unsafe work environment. So you're in that middle ground where a lot of people are. They know there's work to do and they're still on that journey. And then if you're people that are sitting in that 21% that say there's low psychological safety and around 5% that has said responded with very low, if you're leaders, the time to address that is now. If you're staff members and you've responded that way because you've had a personal experience with that low psychological safety, then there's things that you can do about that as well. So thank you for everybody engaging. That's really insightful. But 38% sat in that moderate middle ground. So very promising. I won't tell you the results I get when I do this poll in the United States. So microaggressions. So we've all been in situations at work when someone says or does something that feels hostile or offensive to some aspect of our identity, and the person doesn't even realize it. Flippant comments and remarks. These kinds of actions, insensitive statements, questions or assumptions are called microaggressions, and they can target many aspects of who we are. For example, they could be related to someone's race, gender, sexuality, parental status, socioeconomic background, mental health, or disability. These are the everyday verbal, non-verbal, and environmental slights, ignoring a person or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, and negative messages. The research is clear about the impact seemingly innocuous statements like these can have on one's physical and mental health, especially over the course of an entire career. Most often, microaggressions are aimed at traditionally marginalised identity groups. So, for example, people from different cultural backgrounds or culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and people from people with disability, for example. These hurtful actions cannot happen to anyone, however, and of any background at any professional level. A microaggression against someone from a culturally and linguistically diverse background might sound something like, and I have heard this myself in a workplace before, your English is great for someone who isn't from this country. Against a white male, it might be, oh, you don't ever have to worry about fitting in, indicating that all white men are always comfortable and accepted. And for people with disability, comments like, I could never deal with that, how do you cope? It must be so hard, can be really hurtful, as can be seemingly helpful phrases. And again, I've heard this unfortunately in a workplace, like, let me do this for you, then we'll be able to finish on time. Deciding for others how bad their disability is or isn't, for example, without understanding the full impact of someone's disability or situation or circumstances can be really dismissive. Not all disabilities, as we know, are visible, and each person's experience is different to others. Essentially, microaggressions are based on a simple, damaging idea that because you are X, you are probably Y. So I have another poll question for you. Oops. Have you encountered microaggressions like this in your workplace? Either observed it or been somebody on the receiving end of a microaggression? And if so, how effectively were these addressed? Yeah. This one never surprises me, sadly. So we've got 76% so far saying that yes, they have, and it wasn't effectively addressed. It's going up. I would love in a few years that everybody says they may have experienced this, but it's always been effectively addressed. So as you can see, it's a journey, but leaders have a really key role to play in ensuring that there's a zero tolerance to things like this in the workplace, when we're particularly when we're talking about psychological safety and employee health and mental health and wellbeing. So far, 76% of the audience has said yes, they have encountered microaggressions in the workplace, and it has not been effectively addressed. And just for it's really interesting actually that only 6% have said yes, but it's been effectively addressed. 13% said no. So there's work to do. So when we talk about psychological safety and the benefits, which I've just explained, it really impacts what we call interpersonal risk-taking. So psychological safety allows for team members to take interpersonal risks, such as proposing new ideas, challenging the status quo, without fear of negative consequences or things like judgment in the workplace. And this risk-taking is crucial for fostering not only collaboration, but also innovation and creative problem solving. So organisations with a strong culture of psychological safety tend to be more innovative because employees feel empowered to think outside the box and experiment with different and new approaches. Then if we move to the middle of that slide where it says interpersonal circumflex model, the interpersonal circumflex model maps out various interpersonal behaviours. So it's things like the balance or the intersecting relationship between dominance versus submission, friendliness versus hostility, and how they influence team interactions. So understanding these dynamics can help leaders create environments where positive behaviours are reinforced, and most importantly, negative ones are addressed and further prompting, which further prompts psychological safety. If team members see leaders taking action when it comes to these things we're talking about, that in itself is enhancing psychological safety in the workplace. So then when it comes to encouraging innovation and creativity through interpersonal risk taking. Interpersonal risk taking, like I said just earlier, is the willingness of team members to express ideas, ask questions, and admit mistakes, even when the outcome's uncertain. So people aren't really paranoid that they're going to face negative consequences for speaking up or contributing or participating. And psychological safety creates a secure environment where employees feel empowered to take these interpersonal risks, knowing that they won't be judged or penalised for doing so. This risk-taking is essential for innovation and creativity and allows for the free exchange of ideas, brainstorming, and the exploration of new approaches without fear of criticism. And that's really critical in all organisations, but particularly as organisations grow and expand, because what I see a lot in my work is that siloed situation that we see a lot, particularly in large organisations, where people and it could be due to psychological safety, they keep those ideas to themselves. They really are quite protective over their work, and they're less willing to share in the workplace. So, another poll question for you. What do you believe is the most significant barrier to creating a psychologically safe environment? This is always a really interesting one because there's no wrong answer. Wow. 68% have said leadership style. Yeah. If I had to do this poll, and I have obviously, but if I did this with you this afternoon, I would also say that for me and from my observations, research, and the work that I do, I would say the most significant barrier to creating a psychologically safe environment is the leadership. And that is also leadership style, but it is the leaders, and it encompasses things like their level of emotional intelligence, but also their willingness to not only identify, but also, most importantly, address these issues that create psychologically unsafe environments. So again, there's no wrong answer here, but it's really interesting to see that 63% of you that did respond said leadership style. Okay. So when we talk about the how, based on my experience co-designing and delivering a number of tailored, my background is human services and nonprofit. So based on my experience developing a lot of those programs, and in my consulting practice, I know that positive psychology plays a key role in this process of creating psychologically safe workplaces. Because by supporting individuals to develop a growth mindset, resilience, confidence, and self efficacy, we start creating that and focusing in on employee health and well-being. By adopting a strengths-based approach and focusing on possibilities rather than limitations, we empower people, employees, to shift their mindset on how they perceive challenges to achieving their goals. And so leaders, if you maybe while you're listening to me talk, you can think about what's one of the most effective leaders you've ever come across, whether you've reported to them, whether you've observed them in your career, whether they're in your organisation right now. They are usually going to be a leader that adopts a strengths-based approach, which is positive psychology in practice. So positive psychology in a workplace involves nurturing the skills and mindsets needed to live a fulfilling life, because we're human beings and who we are at home and in our personal life is the same person as the person that walks through the door at work. So by integrating positive psychology principles into leadership and diversity and inclusion practices, we're empowering people to discover their strengths, their passions, and their values. And there's 5 key dimensions of what we call the PERMA model. It's recently had the H. It's PERMAH, and the H was added recently as health, as the, I guess, 6th dimension. And health was added as a critical success factor for employee health and well-being. So the first one there is positive emotion. That's what the P stands for. And that's about nurturing hope and optimism, and it allows employees to find fulfillment in their daily tasks and persevere with difficult challenges. So I recognise that not everybody is going to love every single task and every hour or every day at work. It's just not it's not realistic. I certainly don't. But if you can enjoy your job, your workplace, and your colleagues, the things that you're doing in your role, it really does change the whole workplace culture. The second dimension, which is engagement, or the E there, is about finding psychological presence or flow in particular activity that deploys a person's skills, strengths, and attention. So effective leaders will usually be able to identify relatively quickly, because they typically have a high degree of emotional intelligence, the strengths of individual team members and how they can leverage those strengths to make a team operate at a more optimal level. So the third dimension there is relationships, and that's critical to well-being and infuses life and work with meaning and purpose. So we all know people, maybe ourselves at times, that have lacked a bit of purpose. It makes it hard to get out of bed in the morning. So evoking those feelings of purpose, joy, belonging, and pride, they're amplified through strong relationships, and they speak to the human need for connection. The sense of meaning and purpose is the idea of serving something bigger than one's own needs, such as that offered through family, community, or societal causes. And then the final component there of the PERMA model relates to accomplishment, which is the feeling gained through meeting goals and ambitions that may be pursued for its own sake in a variety of contexts. So the benefits of adopting positive psychology and models like the PERMA model are that it provides a framework for leaders to intentionally cultivate these qualities through different mediums such as self-reflection and self-assessment with their team members. Now, based on the last poll, leadership is critical in cultivating psychological safety and well-being. And I always say to my coaching or consulting clients that are leaders, the culture of any organisation is shaped by the worst behaviour the leader is willing to tolerate. This couldn't be more accurate when thinking about fostering workplace psychological safety and well-being. So establishing and building psychological safety is all about how you show up as a leader, and it's surprisingly easy to start injecting into your daily practices. So showing things like understanding, demonstrating engagement, and being inclusive are just a few of the ways that leaders can start building the foundations of psychological safety in their own teams. We all know that leadership, those of us that have been leaders, we know that it can be incredibly rewarding as an experience, but it can also be really challenging. So supporting your people who have a range of diverse needs can be really daunting. And this is where harnessing the power of psychological safety as part of your leadership style can ease that load. People with disability know what they need, for example. They just need to know that in the workplace it's safe to ask for it. As a leader, you don't need to intimately understand the lived experience of being neurodiverse or vision impaired, for instance, to have the humility and empathy to create an environment where someone who does can thrive. Inclusive and trauma-informed leadership is critical to fostering workplace psychological safety and well-being. And trauma-informed leaders accept different ways of doing the work and acknowledge and validate the knowledge that people possess. When holding staff accountable, they're constructive and they're compassionate. They give staff the benefit of the doubt and they acknowledge their hard work and decisions. And it's up to trauma-informed leaders to be able to recognise the signs of traumatic stress, communicate effectively and compassionately in times of crisis, and support those they lead. It's important to lead by example by asking, as leaders, for feedback. Sometimes we shy away from that. Acknowledging our mistakes, seeing different opinions, and being approachable. Leaders should encourage active listening by encouraging people to share more by asking questions and making them feel that their input is valuable. Creating a safe environment can be done by accepting ideas, being non-judgmental, and looking for innovative approaches to projects, to engaging with your team, and to a raft of other things. And developing an open mindset as a leader is absolutely critical. Research demonstrates the importance of open mindsets in helping teams become comfortable with taking risks, continuous learning, and improvement and feedback. So as leaders, we need to learn the language of workplace psychological safety and invite what I call airing and sharing. We also, importantly, have to measure and monitor the levels of fearlessness and psychological safety in our teams and in our organisations. And we need to lead from the front. We can't come to work with our armour on because as human beings, we're hardwired to seek connection, which can only happen when we're ourselves. So we need to, as leaders, be vulnerable and authentic, as hard as that can be at times. We need to destigmatise failure, look forward, offer help, consider and brainstorm next steps, and really importantly, sanction clear violations. Need to have clear boundaries and hold people accountable without shame or blame when it comes to fostering psychological safety and well-being. Now I have another poll question for you all. How often do team members or yourselves in your team or organisation feel comfortable sharing new ideas or concerns? This is looking positive. Okay, so 42% so far is saying often, 34% is saying sometimes, which I think is a correlation with an earlier poll where people said they were sitting in that moderate space when it came to psychological safety. But 43% of you responded with often, which is great. Because that's one of those key indicators of a workplace that is either psychologically safe or on track to, they're making changes in the positive direction of becoming psychologically safe. 35% of you responded with sometimes. So that's that middle ground I think that we saw earlier. Okay, so when it comes to implementing practices for employee wellbeing, we've got a couple here, but I'll start with one. So evaluating current workplace practices and policies with an eye toward employee psychological safety and wellbeing. So you can do a survey, an anonymous survey, to really gauge how people are feeling when it comes to how psychologically safe and fearless they're feeling in the workplace. Regularly check in with your employees to understand their current concerns and challenges. Also implementing evidence-based strategies to address issues impacting employee mental health and overall well-being. Really effective leaders are going to know when something isn't right with their employee health and wellbeing, mental health and wellbeing. And typically, effective leaders will have a keen eye on this because they recognise the damage this will do to either a team or to an organisation, and then they will mitigate those risks swiftly. So that's a little diagram there that you can take away on your slides as far as implementing some of those practices. Very high level when it comes to employee wellbeing. Now, I believe this is our last poll question. I've put these in here because it is the afternoon and people get a little sleepy. They hit a bit of a wall in the afternoon. So I wanted to make sure you're all still awake. So the final poll question is, how confident do you feel in your ability to identify and address issues impacting employee wellbeing? Now, you don't have to be a leader to identify these. This could be you're not in a leadership or managerial position. But this is important for peers as well. And these results are really positive. So we have 73% saying somewhat confident, or 71%. And that, again, correlates with those previous poll questions around how psychologically safe do you feel your workplace is, and the last poll question that we had. So I'm not surprised to see somewhat confident is probably the highest one there at 73%. 20% of you are saying very confident, which is wonderful. And then 6% saying not confident. And that's why, like I said, this is an ongoing, continuous journey. So now I will just pop the last slide up, more for some reflection before we take questions about what will you do better in your organisation, whether you're a leader or not. What will you change, or what would you like to change? And what would you or will you do differently to ensure that your workplace fosters psychological safety and wellbeing? Thank you, everybody.
All right, so thank you to our presenter, Kylie Van Leeuwen from Elevated Coaching and Consulting Global, for your WorkSafe Tasmania Month webinar today, Building Resilient Minds, Cultivating Psychological Safety for sorry, I've got the words mixed up with your presentation. There's opportunity now for everyone to ask Kylie any questions. So please use the chat panel on your screen to type and submit those questions or comments for Kylie today. So Kylie, just a general comment, get management to do a risk assessment, develop a policy procedure, and train managers and workers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always say it starts with awareness, because you don't know what you don't know, right? And so if you suspect as a leader that there's an issue with psychological safety and mental health and employee wellbeing in your organisation, I would say it's that awareness piece that we have to start with. But definitely do a risk assessment. You have to understand your employees to understand what the problems are, what the barriers are, because without knowing that, we can't build a solution. And so, Ingrid, I absolutely agree with that. But training managers, we do a lot of training with managers around not just psychological safety and workplace inclusion and wellbeing, but things like emotional intelligence and how to lead from the front and lead differently. Because again, a lot of leaders, they're not always aware of their leadership style or how it could be impacting others around them. It's like parenting styles sometimes. So I absolutely agree with that comment.
Thanks. And as well, this is probably more of a comment than a question, but again, thank you for your specific examples, Kylie, of microaggressions, specifically those in relation to people with disabilities and those who are neurodivergent. I feel like this will better help me to identify and call out instances of this.
Thank you. Appreciate that feedback.
Question. As a rehab provider, it feels like assisting a client who does not feel psychologically safe is out of my scope, except assisting with improving their resilience. What else can I do as a WRP?
We do a lot of work in this space too. I would say around that positive psychology. So if you're looking to assist your client with improving their resilience, I would look into adopting a strengths-based approach, looking at that positive psychology, and looking at the mindset side of things. So we know that resilience is a state of mind, but we know that there's always room for improvement when it comes to things like resilience and self-efficacy. So I would say have a look at adopting a strengths-based approach, what that means. It's hard for me to give any type of additional advice because I don't know the person. But when we talk about trauma-informed principles and practices, that might also be helpful in understanding how to work with that person closely to build their resilience. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Kylie. How does management enable a sideways, I should say, reporting mechanism to assist small siloed units where an issue begins to emerge? Often workers are not keen to report, so they don't rock the boat, so to speak. Then it becomes too late.
Mm. We do a decent amount of work in this space actually, and one of the things is just observing. So if you've potentially um, tried something like an employee survey, an anonymous survey, to gauge how fearless your team feels or how psychologically safe, or to gauge the level of well-being amongst your employees. If that hasn't worked or you feel that people aren't responding to those types of surveys, typically we come in as independent consultants and we do some observations. Just work. I don't need to do much. I just sit into an open plan office, and usually within a couple of hours, I can pinpoint what's going on, just through body language and observing interactions. Of course, they're those interactions that aren't behind closed doors, but a lot of it could be observational. So if you've done the surveys or you've tried to gather feedback from a team or individuals within a team, I would say whether somebody within the organisation, whether it's within HR or an external consultant, come in and do some observations. But also you can engage people to do some interviews, again, that may or may not be anonymous, to protect the psychological safety of those staff.
Thanks, Kylie. A comment and then a question. So, thank you for your talk, Kylie. I'm living with a chronic condition, and whilst I have generally had a lot of support within my workplace, I have recently noticed my direct line manager has changed in their approach. To me, I'm finding a lot more micromanagement where I have previously been allowed the freedom to complete my work around my physical health. I believe it is a matter of convenience of when to believe support me. Can you provide some information about this?
Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that. And we do a lot of work in the employee space, supporting people that are in your very situation, and also people living with similar conditions as yourself. My advice would be, again, it depends on your level of comfortability. I don't know how psychologically safe you feel in that workplace to have a conversation with your leader or with human resources. One thing I do say is that if you're not feeling psychologically safe, you may want to seek external advice before proceeding with any internal conversations. Typically, though, this is for situations that have escalated quite quickly, and an employee similar to yourself, might feel that they're being micromanaged or moved out of the business, or that it's leading in that direction. So again, it depends on your level of psychological safety. Your employer would know that it's unlawful to go down a path of micromanaging somebody where it could be perceived as discrimination because of a health condition. But it's really dependent your actions and the next steps you take on your level of psychological safety. If it were me, I would seek some external advice around that. Because as much as I practice in human resources teams are paid by your employer.
Thanks, Kylie. Uh, and we have another couple of questions before we shortly wrap up. So one comment, most people find it very difficult to speak up and report issues when they are in a psychological unsafe environment, difficult to get support without feeling there might be ramifications.
And this is the sad thing, because I believe that psychological safety or psychological harm, abuse, and injuries, even in a country like Australia where we have legislation to protect people from psychological abuse, um, it's underreported for this very reason. People will resign before they take action against things like psychological abuse and harm. And so I know you've made a comment, I wholeheartedly agree with it. It's one of those things where how do you create avenues for people to feel safe in making a complaint, seeking internal advice around these things in an organisation where they feel that there'll be ramifications for doing just that. Again, similar to my comment earlier, I would seek some external advice around that and the best steps for going forward. Where you can, I guess this isn't the forum to elaborate on your workplace situation, but it's definitely worth exploring how you can address it so that you're not suffering.
Thank you, Kylie. And just to end off some comments that have come through, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your informative session. So on that note, we'd like to thank our presenter, Kylie Van Leeuwen from Elevated Coaching and Consulting Global, for her WorkSafe Tasmania Month webinar today, Building Resilient Minds, Cultivating Psychological Safety for Enhanced Mental Health and Wellbeing. Thank you everyone for attending today's WorkSafe Tasmania Month webinar. WorkSafe Tasmania Month runs throughout the month of October, so please head to worksafe.tas.gov.au to see what other webinars and in-person events we are running here in Tasmania throughout the month of October. Today's webinar has also been recorded and will be made available on the WorkSafe Tasmania YouTube page towards the end of October. You will also receive a feedback survey. Please complete that feedback. We value your comments and your thoughts about today's webinar and WorkSafe Month in general. So again, thank you to Kylie, and thank you for everyone attending, and have a safe and healthy day.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.